Oh, thanks, Emma. We're being recorded. And welcome to Tools and Strategies for Explaining MBTA Communities Zoning, as if it were that easy. So it's March 19th today, which I think that means tomorrow's the first day of spring. It also means we are about 9 months away for the deadline for compliance with Section 3A for many of your communities. And despite all the press about Milton, what we're seeing from our side, providing technical assistance to, at this point, 120 cities and towns, is most communities are kind of chugging along. And as Milton did, they tried to put something out there. So our goal of this session is to hear from some consultants and planners who have been actively working with boards, committees, town meetings, city councils to get their new districts adopted, with the goal of highlighting how they actually explained this, which is legitimately a difficult thing. It's a new thing. And so we're going to start with Judi Barrett, who's the founder and president of Barrett Planning Group, and Ian Burns from the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. So these two, as consultants, are working with a number of communities. And then we're going to switch over to 3 communities that have had their own challenges and are at different places in the process in terms of getting a district adopted in their community. So let's see where we're at. My goodness, we already have 64 people here. So I think, Judi, if you want to, oh, also, let's just talk a little. If you could put questions and comments in the chat, I will sort of navigate those, and we may make a strategic decision to interrupt with questions or hold them till the end. But go ahead and use the chat feature. And now I'm going to turn it over to Judi Barrett, who most of you know.
If I could just jump in quickly, if folks need closed captions, there should be a button in the bottom of the toolbar, and you can click that to turn them on.
Thank you.
Super, thanks. So like everybody else, I've got slides, because what will we do without a slide presentation, right? So I'm just going to open mine up and walk through them and pepper it with a number of comments. Let me see. And welcome everybody, by the way. I hope you're all doing well. So we were asked to talk about strategies for explaining this law, and a lot of what I'm going to say will be very familiar to most people in this meeting, because you've kind of heard a lot of this before. Mainly, I want to just underscore some things that tend to come up in the communities we have worked in, and talk a little bit about how we have addressed them or encouraged our clients to address them. So we're working with a number of the communities, in part through MHP's 3HEA program, and also with some communities that decided to hire us directly. So when the conversation starts about MBTA communities, I feel like a lot of our towns, especially the smaller ones or the outlying suburbs, feel like they're walking into the unknown. And the fear of the unknown kind of grips and takes over. And a lot of the questions that come up are just because people feel like they're being asked to do something that's very alien to them in terms of how they regulate land use and housing in particular. And for that reason, I think it's important for all of us to just try to get the facts straight when we're talking to cities and towns. And I'm sure you're all doing that. And it may very well be that a lot of what I'm going to cover, you've already been asked, but these are the things that tend to come up in the places that we work in. I just think facts are really rule of the day, and it's just important to get that information out. So people ask us, what is this law? And, as I think you all know, this is really around housing choice, which really is sort of 2 pieces, one of which is the MBTA Communities Law, and the other is trying to make it easier for communities anywhere to adopt provisions in their zoning that make it easier to develop housing. And so it's important not to lose sight of that part as well for those who are not MBTA communities, but for those who are, the requirement is to have zoning for what is called as of right or permitted uses for multifamily housing development. It's really that simple. And it applies in a certain number of communities, kind of between Boston and Worcester, where there is some type of MBTA service or access to it. I think it's important that while we're trying to explain that this is a requirement and it's something you have to do because the law says you have to do it, that there is an underlying purpose here, and it's important not to lose sight of it. There is a housing problem in Massachusetts. My own firm lost a lovely young planner about a year ago to a position in the Southwest where arguably she took somewhat of a cut in pay, but also was saving $12,000 a year in housing costs. So, it is true that younger people are really struggling to live in Massachusetts. And I think almost any community we have at some level is going to understand that. And it's important to not lose sight of why this law exists, because we focus sometimes too much on what it says we have to do. Why do we do this? Because we need to provide more types of housing choices. I think that's kind of obvious in most of our places. Anybody who has an adult child who's still living at home certainly has some understanding of what it means to need housing choices and to boost supply. We've all heard this over and over again, and communities sometimes cringe when they hear this, but it's important to understand why we have this law in addition to what it says. So we're not afraid to address that. So what is this law? I call it an umbrella law because it's a very broadly written piece of legislation, and that has been both an asset and a liability, I think, as we've gone through the process of trying to implement it. So the legislature created this, sort of broad structure for, we have to have multifamily housing as a right at 15 units an acre in the communities that are subject to the law. There can't be bedroom restrictions. The housing has to be appropriate for families if they choose to live there. If you have a train station or other MBTA facility, it has to be within, or a lot of it has to be within a half mile of that facility, if that's possible to do. It has to be a district of reasonable size, which the statute doesn't define. And there are penalties for noncompliance in the statute, which the statute talks about these 3 grant programs that I think you're all very familiar with. The statute then goes on to say that the Executive Office of Livable Housing and Livable Communities shall set guidelines and determine a community's compliance. So, they sort of got pulled into this like 177 cities and towns did, and we're all trying to figure out how to make this work. But I think of it as an umbrella because really a lot of what we end up hearing about are questions that have to do with the guidelines themselves. So my experience in the communities where we've worked is that there are things that tend to help, and I'm going to mention a couple of communities where these things apply. Forming a working group or a steering committee and getting residents involved early in the planning process can make a big difference. People at least feel like they've had some ability to influence how the decisions were made. Maintaining timely updates on your town website. I suspect many of you are doing this, but I just did a little of a quick survey last night, looking around at websites for communities that are subject to the law, and the practice has kind of varied a lot. And I do know some websites are just easier to work with than others, but there's some communities have done very well with just saying, this is all the stuff that we've done really from the beginning. So it's all very clear to the public that this just didn't fall out of nowhere, overnight. Countering scare tactics and misinformation, because it is out there. It's out there in social media. It's in our local papers. It comes up in meetings. It is important to kind of counter this stuff early and factually, and being very, sort of dispassionate about it, but just countering misinformation. I think as planners, as planning board members, as community development staff, whatever your role is, and certainly as consultants as well, it's just being very practical, even keel, being factual, being responsive. Don't let angry email wait. Respond to people, respond, in a diplomatic way, and just be helpful. And then the other thing I think that's really important, and the 2 communities I'm going to refer to momentarily both did this, is if you're going to have a public participation process and you're going to ask people for input, don't be afraid to change course. If in fact people have ideas about perhaps making the district better for the community or better in terms of its impact on a particular part of town, so if you're going to ask for public involvement and public comment, take it to heart. I would not put the entire responsibility for figuring out MBTA communities compliance on the backs of town staff. or consultants or others who are sort of sometimes not seen as part of the community. It is not a limit. The responsibility for making this work isn't on a few people, it's on a lot of people. And the more you cast that net out, I think the better off everybody's going to be. And then don't go into a huddle and forget to talk about your community. Again, I think just being open and transparent is really, really important in these cases where I think things are going better than not. So there are common questions that tend to come up, and Jack can just sort of shed some light on some of the answers that we have given. Again, some of these may be very resonant for all of you. And one is Massachusetts is a home rule state. This is one of my favorite things. I've heard this my entire career. Massachusetts is a home rule state. Doesn't that mean we can do whatever we want? And the fact is, no, that is not what home rule is about. Home rule has boundaries in Massachusetts. It has boundaries in every state where it exists. So you have to think about, well, what actually does the state constitution say? Because it doesn't say it's a free for all. It does say that your city or town can adopt, a wide variety of laws or ordinances as long as you're not in conflict with state law or the state constitution. And essentially what that means is that if state law has asserted a statewide interest, that takes precedent over local control. That's just the way it is. And this is not the only example we have of a situation where the state has intervened and said there is a statewide interest that does trump city or town or local concerns. The Zoning Act already identifies a number of things that you have to allow. And they may not be as offensive to some people as multifamily housing, but nonetheless, here they are. You can't stop a farm on 5 or more acres. You can't stop a church. You can't stop schools. You can't stop childcare centers. You can't block modifications to buildings to accommodate people with disabilities. These are just basic things that communities have to do, and there are others. And all that really 3A is saying is, and if you're an MBTA community, you can't block multifamily housing on an as of right basis in some part of your community. That's really kind of all we've done here. There are lots of other laws that apply to cities and towns that the general court has enacted that override local land use policies. And I think it's just important for people to understand that. I wouldn't dwell on it, but this comes up all the time. I think sometimes we've made too much out of what it means to be a home rule state, and it's given rise to a lot of mythology. Another thing we hear a lot is the developers are going to be able to do whatever they want. Anybody who might have been at the Citizen Planner Training Collaborative Conference on Saturday probably has a sense that that's not really the case, but you didn't have to be there to figure this out. There are other laws that still apply. The Wetlands Protection Act still applies. Your local wetlands bylaw still applies. Anything that's not zoning still applies in these districts. And so, you have to really think about, well, what does that actually mean? If you don't have sewer, for example, you've got an on-site wastewater disposal cap of 10,000 gallons per day, which is essentially works out to about 90 bedrooms. Trying to build a wastewater treatment facility can cost 10 times or more of what it costs to build an on-site system. It's not always feasible to do. So, there's a reference guide actually that I think everybody should be aware of. It was published a few years ago. MHP actually had Joe Pesnola do this product, but it's called Sewage Rules Create Gap in Housing Supply in Massachusetts. And everybody ought to read it because it'll give you a sense of just kind of what development is up against in terms of hurdles in order to trying to make housing built when you don't have sewer. Many of you may be aware of an article that was in Banker and Tradesman within the last few days. It's a wonderful story about Needham and Watertown really kind of upzoning to accommodate housing under this law, or Needham's working toward it. They haven't had their town meeting yet, I don't think. But I mean, those are locations that have sewer, and the conversations in those communities really can be a lot more creative in some ways than in the smaller towns. So the smaller town zoning isn't like that. And I just think people need to understand that it is going to be really a challenge for developers to make this zoning work in the way that I think the legislature may have envisioned. So don't make it harder. It's really, I think, the message I want to say, and help your public understand that it can be really difficult to develop on these smaller sites at a density that I'm almost afraid to say this because people will want to have my head for saying it. 15 units an acre is not super high density. And so trying to make these projects work without benefit of adequate infrastructure is going to be difficult, but your town is not responsible for providing it. And this is, of course, to my next point, which is people say it's going to cost us a lot of money. And no, actually, you don't have to make land construction ready for multifamily housing. You're not responsible for extending infrastructure. You're not responsible for building roads. You know, it's really the developer's problem. Your duty under the MBTA Communities Law is to provide the regulatory framework through zoning to enable that development to occur. But all those other pieces really are the responsibility of someone else. And generally, it's going to be the applicant. The age restriction one is another one that comes up a lot. Well, it says we have to allow housing for families. So does that mean we can't have senior housing in our MBTA communities district? This just came up in one of the towns we're working in a week ago. And that's not what it means at all. Developers certainly can apply to build senior housing if he or she chooses. You just can't require it. I think the premise of the statute is that the market and not zoning is going to determine what should be built. And if developer thinks that he or she can build senior housing economically in an MBTA communities district, that's what's going to be proposed, but you can't require it. So another thing that came up again in another meeting last week was, isn't it about public transportation? We don't have a train station in our town. Why do we have to do this? You have to think about what the definition of an MBTA community is. You may have a rapid transit station, a commuter station, a ferry terminal, like the one that's right across the street from my office in Hingham. You have those things, or you are other served communities. And that's that umbrella again for a lot of towns that receive the benefit of MBTA communities, MBTA service, even if it's not right within the borders of your own municipality. So the premise of the law is encouraging more housing where there's reasonable access to that public transportation. Despite what I think a number of people believe, Housing and Livable Communities as a state agency really has not expanded the reach of the law beyond what the statute says. They, like I think everyone, are trying to figure out how best to make this work in all of the different types of communities that are subject to the law. Another question that often comes up is, well, according to Housing and Livable Communities, we only need 750 units. We're an adjacent town. Why is our zoned capacity coming out to 802? This comes up a fair amount. The compliance model, if any of you have worked with it, I can say two things about it. It is ingenious and it's complicated, and both are true. So there are kind of potential issues that you have to think about when you're doing this modeling. And we've done a fair amount of it. I think we're pretty comfortable with the model at this point. Districts with small parcels and multiple streets and have lots of excluded land, it can be trickier to end up with a district that is really close to your zoned capacity number because you just lose a lot of land. So the more land you add, it just sort of creates additional complications in trying to get to that zoned capacity number. In the meantime, of course, communities want us to keep them as close as possible to their zoned capacity number so they don't go over it. So you're constantly trying to sort of manipulate the dimensional requirements that you can control in the model in order to get very close to that number. All I can say is it's just very difficult to get to all of the major requirements that the model accommodates and still stay exactly at your zoned capacity number. So you're likely to go a bit over it. I think showing maps of what you're doing is very helpful, especially showing maps that illustrate how the configuration of your proposed districts changes as you do additional modeling. So everybody can see in the end how a decision was reached. I don't think there's any substitute for just continuous public education and involvement at the local level. And again, responding to community suggestions as people see the maps. They may in fact have some really good ideas about perhaps other land that should be added to a particular area, and look at it. And if the answer is it doesn't work, then the answer is it doesn't work. But at least you haven't completely dismissed what someone has to say. The only thing I would add, however, is that when you're being asked to consider additional areas and you're trying to respond to those suggestions, you can actually end up a little further afield from the requirements and what the modeling allows you to do. So just bear in mind, the modeling is really sort of key to illustrating that you comply from a technical point of view. But it's not going to ever, or rarely it's going to get you to the sort of perfect zone capacity number that people think somehow is all, quote, all they have to do. So a couple of communities that I think have just done a really stellar job responding to their residents. Andover is one. I'm sure I've lost count because we've been in a lot of these meetings, but there have been at least 10 public working group meetings. Working group was formed really early on to sort of get citizen input. The district configurations evolved as a result of that working group involvement. The town planner had conversation with the planner sessions where people were making themselves available as staff to answer questions from the public or have a dialogue with people about what was happening as the process went forward. There were planning board meetings. There were meetings with the historical commission and other town boards and committees. There were staff and consultant meetings, many. I don't even want to begin to tell you how many. Constant website updates. They did a fabulous job on their website, keeping people posted about every single meeting that was happening. And as things changed, it was posted. Andover also benefited from the fact that they had done a recent master plan update. So some of the themes and ideas that are in the master plan became kind of a good foundation to work from in discussing this with the public. The other thing Andover had going for it, and they capitalized on it well, was having an existing overlay district in the downtown area that almost complies as it is, even without any changes. So some of the conversation in Andover was resonant for people, but that area alone in the overlay district wasn't going to satisfy all the requirements for MBTA communities, and they did have to look elsewhere. So now, because the areas have been selected, they've been able to show people, this is where we're going. Here it is on a town-wide map. These are examples of kind of structures that already exist in these locations. Easton's another town that I have to just say has done, I think, a fabulous job communicating with the public and also changing their plans based on public input. So again, if you go to Easton's website, you can see the whole record right down to the very beginning of the first select board meeting in January of 2022, where they started talking about how are we going to approach this law. And a lot of work was done on just sort of mapping and figuring out where to go. They did an economic feasibility analysis to try to test whether they could do more than the 10% minimum affordable housing units that are allowed under the guidelines. After receiving public feedback, they actually changed the configuration of their proposed districts. So they now have 3 locations that they're planning to discuss. So it's a good example of where the community did a lot of outreach, got a lot of feedback, and was willing to shift gears. So it was a good test case. They did a good job working with their residents. Another thing we hear is this is going to destroy our town character. I've been in this business for 35 years, and I'll tell you, I often find it that communities have great difficulty actually defining what they mean by town character. And this process sometimes brings that discussion out in helpful ways and sometimes not so helpful ways. I would just say, this process, unlike many others, really gives your town an opportunity to plan, and you should take advantage of it. Many communities have not done this kind of planning for a long time. I find, because I do a lot of work with Chapter 40B, that people complain that Chapter 40B just sort of dumps development in locations where developers want to be, regardless of what the community says. Well, this is an opportunity to change that narrative and actually think about where you would want to encourage some higher density housing development and housing of different types. Look for precedents in your own community. If you're a very small town and you say, we really don't have anything like this, kind of look around you in your adjacent communities. The precedents are out there. You have to have an inquiring mind to find them. And then this last one, this is one of my favorite issues. What about our schools? Studies there are common answers to this. And often it's aided by fiscal impact studies, which in my past career, I did many of, and I was good at it and I loved them, but I've come to the conclusion they are very damaging. So the common answers to this question are, studies have shown that new multifamily housing doesn't cause growth in school enrollments. Multifamily households are smaller than single-family households. Single-family homes cost more to serve than multifamily apartments. We have all heard this. as a planner, I think those are the wrong answers. The right answer is you can't base housing policy decisions on who gets to live in a dwelling unit. And familial status is protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And I think a lot of communities do not know that. As planners, it's our job to tell them. So those are my thoughts on all this. I have a feeling that means that Ian may be next. Am I right?
Hop right in, Katie, unless you wanted to.
Nope, that's
for
exactly
anything?
right. Ian, take it away.
Alrighty, very good. Let me go ahead and share my slides here. Thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you, Judi, for that fantastic presentation. I tried to take a look at what Judi was going to present to not overlap too much, but I will definitely give a +1 to everything Judi mentioned, because it certainly is key to a lot of this. And there are a couple things I'll mention that kind of build off of that, but I would not disagree with anything that was said previously. So glad to kind of build off of it. So my name is Ian Burns. I'm with the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. Many of you are familiar with regional planning agencies. We're one of 13 RPAs in the Commonwealth. We serve 15 cities and towns here in Northeast Massachusetts, kind of starting in Lawrence, following the Merrimack River all the way to the coast in Newburyport, that region here in the state. And as a regional planning agency, we're providing consulting services to 9 of our member communities, and it spans 3 of the category types, everything except rapid transit. So we have commuter rail communities, adjacent communities, and adjacent small towns where we're providing in-depth, really hand-holding consulting services. However, in all of our communities, we're kind of there to help bounce some ideas off of and provide additional services. So kind of how Judi started her presentation of walking into the void, I want to take a step back for a second and just recognize that this is very complicated stuff that we're dealing with. And I think we all need to reflect on the fact that this is one of the most significant state zoning laws that has come down in decades. And it's a huge change that a lot of us need to adjust to. And I mean, there's 84 of us on the call here today, and every single person on this call has been putting, I think, their best foot forward in trying to make these changes. And so I just want to recognize the amount of effort that everyone has been doing, both on the state level, the regional level, the local level, all across the board. I think we all deserve a little bit of credit for getting things to this point, because it's a lot that's gone into it. And for those in town meeting, I think you need to recognize that, of course, we don't know what happens at town meeting. There's a lot of unknown, but it is a win to get these articles to the town meeting point and to get this to a vote. In many of our communities, they've never voted on by right multifamily zoning before. So just getting something to town meeting, I think you all deserve some credit for putting a lot of effort into there, and that we're not sure what will happen over the next year. There's a lot of unknowns, but I give a lot of credit to the folks doing a lot there. And to some of Judi's points, there's no silver bullet here, but let's try and find really the best approach here. So I want to cover 5 main topics that we've been noticing. Number 1, leading with zoning and not development. Each of these I'll kind of break down in the next few slides. Tackling that unit capacity misinterpretation. So Judi talked a lot about that, and we hear a lot too, so I wanted to spend some time on that. The question about 15 units per acre, and that's coming up all the time. How do we accommodate that density if we haven't seen that density? Carrots or sticks? I think we keep hearing this conversation about, do we want to talk about the threats that are looming, or do we want to talk about the advantages of this? And I think that's dependent on the community, but I wanted to touch on how various places address it. And then finally, what are some community engagement pieces that we're doing that you might want to think about or adopt? Throughout this presentation, I have kind of my own comments specifically for this webinar, but then you'll see I have some slides that are outlined in red, and those are just taken directly from presentations we've done, so you can see some samples of the language and presentations that we've used. So let's hop right in, leading with zoning and not development. And many of you know this by now. It's been a long conversation, but this is a zoning change. We are not counting units that we already have. We're not counting construction units. We only need to figure out the zoning that exists. So we need to emphasize that upfront and throughout every presentation and communication with the public. I think it's very easy. I often trip up on the development or future development or that sort of thing. But let's keep in mind that we're talking about any development that is really theoretical. All we're doing is changing the zoning. And as a piece of that, what I think is really important is to explain what needs to happen for development to actually occur. And so as Judi was mentioning, there's a lot of things that you have a process for in your community. So really talk to your residents about what does zoning do, but then what comes after zoning? Zoning is only step one in a development process. What are 2, 3, 4, etc., those steps that property owners, developers, and local boards need to go through to actually create development? What does your site plan review process look like? Detail those kind of checks along the process so residents understand that just because your requirement, let's say, is 750 units, that doesn't mean that you're permitting a 750 unit development today. You're only creating the zoning. So really, we found it helpful to show folks, here's what happens in the process if a development were to come forward. Tackling that unit capacity confusion. And so this is a really complicated piece, and it gets tricky because really we're just talking about theoretical units and theoretical unit capacity with all of this. So the common quotes that we hear is, we have to allow 750 units, let's say that's your number, and people freaking out again that you're permitting 750 units right now. And then we often show the parcels that are being considered, and the comment is, I don't see how you can fit 100 units on that parcel or 200 units. That doesn't make any sense. That's insane. And so I think one of the things we need to do, no matter what level of detail you give it, is making clear the theoretical nature of the compliance model and its frankly limitations. It's a very powerful tool, and it is great to figure out if we're in compliance, but we need to talk about how that is not a build out analysis. A compliance model is a zoning analysis. And so when you come onto the ground of the areas that you're zoning, the compliance model is assuming perfect site conditions. It's assuming you already have the sewer and water hookups ready to go. The ground is level, there's no soil issues, everything is site ready, which we know is not the case in a lot of these districts. So keep that in mind. Finally, in some cases, we found it helpful to explain the actual compliance model, quote unquote, math. This isn't the case in every single community because we find folks can get lost in the weeds and the numbers. But we have found in some communities, their planning boards are really interested in knowing why, let's say their 10-acre parcel is modeling at 2,000 units or whatever insane number it seems to be. And so we try to break that down for folks, but it's dependent on the audience and if you think that's something that's worthwhile to dig into. So just as a sample, I'll show you what we did. This is a slide from one of our communities where we talked about how the compliance model gets to that number. And many of you are familiar with this, so I won't go down into the details. Essentially what we're doing is looking at what is the land, what's the zoning limitations, and then what's the maximum building footprint we can create. So I'll just point out that the kind of example we have on the bottom there. And so 1 acre lot is really more like 43,000 square feet, but just for simple math, we'll take 40,000 square feet. And so what we talk about with folks is if you have a 40,000 square foot lot, then let's imagine the zoning parameters prevent you from building on half that land, whether it's setbacks or open space requirements, etc. That means you're left with a 20,000 square foot potential building footprint. At 2 stories, you're left with 40,000 square feet of potential structure, meaning you could theoretically accommodate 40 units on the parcel because we're assuming 1,000 square feet per unit. This is very technical, and like I said, doesn't work and isn't necessary everywhere, but we found when people see these numbers laid out, they're suddenly like, oh, every apartment isn't a perfect box of 1,000 square feet, and a developer is not going to be able to build exactly down to the last inch of their footprint and their building envelope, and that sometimes helps folks to make the leap of why these numbers are theory and not necessarily an actual build-out analysis. Judi touched upon this a lot already, so I'll just highlight this one again about the 15 units an acre, folks thinking that it's not possible. So a couple things that we found helpful here. Number one, if you're a community without public sewer, without public water, or both, I think we found it helpful to reference the HLC guidelines because they explicitly state that it's expected development may be less than 15 units an acre due to infrastructure constraints, and they explicitly say that's acceptable because again, we're just talking about zoning, not building. So number one, we've pointed to that a lot to help people understand, and for all the reasons Judi mentioned, help people understand why that's a limitation. Number two, take a look at the density in your community and find some comparable developments. A lot of folks say 15 units an acre does not exist in this town. I will tell you, in many of the rural towns we're working in, even if we can't get to 15, we found at least 10 units an acre existing somewhere. A really helpful tool for this is MHP's residency tool. I don't know if folks on MHP can add that link to the chat, but we've used that a couple times to point out where density exists in a community. And I'll show you a couple examples of how we've worked through that. First, this is just a slide that we've shown in some communities of what exactly the HLC guidelines say. So that third bullet there is a direct quote from HLC guidelines. We've had some residents in communities that, quite frankly, don't believe us when we say it's okay. And they say, is that in writing? Prove it. So now we just come straight with the writing and the quote from the guidelines themselves to show it's okay if the build out is not 15 units an acre because of your infrastructure constraints. I believe all these slides MHP might make available afterwards too as I'm flying through these. So if folks want them, feel free to reach out, or you'll see them on the website in the recording. This is an example from the town of Newbury we were looking at. Again, not a lot of density in that community. It's a small town. They're an adjacent small town. But this one development is actually models out to 11.5 units an acre. And so we have this screenshot of the street view. You can see it's a pretty unassuming building. And then you can see the satellite view to the right there. And so showing residents, this is on Main Street, this is 11.5 units of an acre. You're not that far off from 15 units an acre here. Throw a couple more units on there and you get there. And so we found this pretty commonly. And I would say, if you find that this truly doesn't exist in your community, there's probably another small town nearby where it does, and you can show an example of it. These are some examples from North Andover we showed. We thought these are great examples of being on a smaller lot. And so when we talk about the zoning maybe being in a downtown, and if you're zoning over a lot of quarter acre or half acre lots or tenth of an acre lots even, these are the types of things that could pop up, and we think they're great. You know, on the right's a bit of an older structure, but on the left is a recent remodel and is a great example of how that density and that frankly gentle density can occur when you're zoning on these smaller lots, and that it doesn't have to be a 300 unit housing complex that goes in. Then talking a little bit about community opportunity, you know, how can we use this as an opportunity? This is more of the friendly side of things, and talking about this kind of how Judi was mentioning, what does your community need? I think it's really important to take time to discuss what the housing needs are in your community and how 3A can address those needs. It's kind of a situation where we're saying essentially, this is a state law, we have the regulations, we have to do it. Let's make the best of this and figure out how we can make it fit our community needs. Do we have an aging population, a lack of young adults, signs that are saying we need smaller units? Let's figure out how to make this work to address those population needs. And then Judi talked a little bit about the fiscal impact of the state of the community, but thinking about, you know, a lot of times people say, well, what about all of these issues? Let's not forget that the community can only raise funds through increases in property taxes and new growth. And this is a possibility to create new growth. So unless the residents want to see their bills continue to climb for property taxes, you need new growth, and this might be a way to get there. So just as an example of how we illustrate that when we talk about what the community needs are, I've taken the community needs out of these two, or community names, excuse me, out of these two data slides. But just to show you, in some of our communities, for example, we see that blue line is their 65 plus population roughly doubling from 2010 through 2050. And so showing them, look at this projection, what does this mean for your future housing needs? How can we use 3A to address that? Likely it's smaller units and downsizing. Similar to that, this is another graphic we show a lot where we talk to people about how many people are living in their household units and then how big are those household units. This is a pretty extreme example from one community where they have 1 or 2 person households that make up about half their homes, but 1 or 2 bedroom units only make up about 9% of their housing stock. And so look at that competition for those smaller units that probably exists, and how can you use 3A to build some of those more smaller units so half of your population that's 1 or 2 person households is not competing for 9% of the housing stock. So now just a little bit about carrots or sticks. What's the community opportunity here? So the state set the requirements, and we hear local control all the time. I think we need to focus on the fact that you do have a good amount of local control with this law, and the state has set their parameters, but you have a lot of latitude in deciding where and how this fits. There are likely hundreds of options in all of these communities. The carrots, what are the potential positives for your community? Things we talked about earlier, how can you use it as an opportunity? And the sticks, I mean, oftentimes all the positives, I know as planners, we like to talk about the need for housing and why it's a good thing, etc. But I think we also sometimes recognize that the public only cares about the penalties. And so if you need to talk about that, go back and calculate the funds you've received from those programs over time and what that's created. Finally, I think we talked about kind of the looming Milton threat that's happening right now and what's happening kind of statewide. There's a lot of things we don't know that's going to happen with that lawsuit, and I don't pretend to be able to forecast the future of what's going to happen there. I think what I've noticed though, and one thing that people have latched onto is one of the things in that lawsuit that the AG has asked for is potentially to have the court appoint a special master to draw the district for the town if the town can't figure it out themselves. And so I think we need to focus on the fact people are freaking out about local control. Right now is your opportunity for local control. You know, we haven't seen the state truly take away local control in this yet. And that would be the looming issue. And so if you want to make sure you have local control, let's hop on that opportunity right now and take advantage of it, because in all likelihood, your residents aren't going to want the state to figure this out for you. So don't let the state figure it out for you. We can figure it out now. This is just a slide we show about the different calculations of grants. One of our communities talking about, this was Boxford. They've received over $800,000 in state grants over the past few years that we mentioned, and some example projects saying, you know, these projects might not have happened without it, which is helpful to point to. And then this is more the carrots piece. The town staff in Newbury came up with this slide, which I thought was great, and really speaks to not only what happens if we don't comply, but what happens if we do comply. And so some of this messaging I thought was great, talking about, number one, we're signaling to developers where we want multifamily housing. So if they're going to come in, we're kind of saying this is where we want it. And if you don't have existing zoning, then the developer is going to pick anywhere, essentially, if they're going to do a 40B. And so making sure you can signal to them where you want it. The other thing too is it's really helpful to be able to talk about that housing choice, housing diversity, the need in the town. And so it's just helpful to emphasize kind of what happens if we do comply, not just what happens if we don't. What does this mean for our towns? My last two slides here mentioned some community engagements. Just wanted to give you an idea of what we're doing. So number one, kind of the typical webinars, town hall meetings with presentations and Q&As that we see a lot of folks doing. We're also scheduling several pre-town meeting sessions where the week before town meeting we'll have a presentation and Q&A just dedicated to the 3A warrant article. We've been creating fact sheets for distribution, talking about putting together information tables that would not be staff just standing at a library or senior center with pamphlets about the information, maps, etc. And then one of the other things that we're talking about with several communities is potential for town hall office hours. MVPC, as a town's consultant, we're considering, you know, just go and work at town hall for an afternoon for 3 hours and have drop-in hours for residents to come in and ask questions. And we've seen, you know, that coffee with a planner example in Andover, if you have the planning staff to do it, it is helpful to say, here's our designated office hours, drop by and ask us a question. And wanted to show an example of what those fact sheets have looked like. This is in Newbury, kind of what is section 3A, why is it important, what's required for our town, how can we make our voice heard? So we usually have a summary sheet, and then the back of it, we have a couple examples of some FAQs we've been putting forward so that folks can kind of get a summary item of what's happening in their community before learning more. I think that is all I have for my slides here, and I did speed through it. So like I said, feel free to look online afterwards or reach out to me if you want copies of the slides. Happy to provide them. Wanted to be conscious of my time, so I will end there.
That's awesome. Thank you, Ian. That was really great. I think what we're going to do with our three illustrious guests is have sort of a panel type thing. So I don't know, Emma, if we could do it one at a time, but I'd like to hear from Lee, Erin, and Brian about what happened in each one of their towns. So Lee is the Director of Planning and Development in Plymouth. Erin is the Planning and Community Development Director in the town of Stoneham, and Brian is the Planning Director in the town of Danvers. So why don't you get started off, Lee, and just run by, you know, where you're at in Plymouth, which is a huge community, as you pointed out. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, so when I retire, I never want to hear that term again. That is, you hear that at every meeting, you're on mute. So anyway, good afternoon, everybody. Lee Hartman, Director of Planning and Development for the town of Plymouth. So Plymouth has a representative town meeting. So in some ways that's good. That gives us a different strategy than an open town meeting. We have a zone capacity as an adjacent community of 2,807 units. It's a pretty big number to be looking at and dealing with. I wanted to start off by just thanking the Commonwealth for the money that they gave, the resources. So we were fortunate to be able to hire Judi Barrett's group to help us through the process. And I think really having those resources to help us through the process is critical. And I would say they were probably two of the easiest grants I've ever applied for in my career. So what we did is when we went to the community, we gave them several options. Some of them could create significant more housing, some of them not so much. And so we went through a process and we said, here are some options. What do you as a community think we should do? And we went and had two different public forums that Judi attended, a joint meeting with the planning board and select board, and then a public hearing with the planning board when they reviewed the zoning. And in addition, we also went through and had a PAC TV presentation that Judi and I did that now is playing on the Plymouth area community television show too. So again, I think that outreach was very important. And when we came back to the community, we were saying, this is what we heard from the community. This is what the community has told us. And I think that's a powerful way to explain this so that we're not telling the community what as professionals we think is better. We're responding to what we heard from the community. I'm also pretty lucky that we have the Pine Hills development, 3,500 units on 3,500 acres. The Red Brook development, 1,200 units on 1,600 acres. A nuclear power plant, a 40R in Cottage Park. And at one point, we had a fairly complicated bylaw that was approved for a movie studio that never happened. So I am lucky that in Plymouth, this town is used to dealing with complex issues and understands those complex issues. So again, I think that was very helpful for me in the process. And then I think the only other comment I want to make is that I really think critically the most important thing through the process is having that third-party consultant. People know the planning board, people know the planning staff, and like, oh, here they come again. And having that third party come in and say, hey, here's the good news, here's the bad news, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do, I think is so critical, as is using town council as the other group to give you that kind of guidance and input. So again, I know just want to leave some time, but that's a real quick rundown of what we did. And again, doing that public outreach is really so important. Thank you.
Lee, do you want to just update us a little where
Sure.
Plymouth is at in their process?
Yeah, so we have unanimous approval from the planning board, select board, advisory and finance committee. So advisory and finance committee is, I think, 18 members. Rarely do I ever have unanimous on anything. So that's a pretty rare thing. So we've had unanimous support from all of those groups. And now we have 18 precincts. Each one expects you to come to their own little meeting. So we've been running around at different caucuses, having presentations made. We have a PAC TV, again, our local community television group has done a little 2-minute overview that will start to circulate too with town meeting members and at any of the forums that are going on. So very intensive in Plymouth to public outreach through that process. It's painful, but once it's done, it does help you to get to town meeting. So we have in April, the first Saturday in April is our town meeting. And at this point, again, we've had generally either no response or a positive response for what we've put together and proposed. Judi, you have anything you want to jump into since you've helped me?
No, you did fine. It was great. But the unanimous votes were really gratifying.
Thanks, Lee. Do you want to turn it over to Erin at this point to talk about her experience in Stoneham?
Sure, I'm happy to kind of share my experience here. I'm actually going to share my screen. So I did like a little visual because that's just the kind of gal I am. If that's okay with everyone. So I thought it'd be helpful to kind of share, if everyone can see that, great. I thought it'd be helpful to kind of share kind of about Stoneham and kind of what we're doing and kind of how we got here. So Stoneham is an MBTA adjacent community. We have 24,000 residents located in 6.2 square miles with 36.5 of that land permanently protected for conservation. So I wanted to kind of share that picture of things because I think it's important because we have a lot of people in a very little amount of space. And if you've never been to Stoneham, we're located less than 10 miles north of Boston. But we're an adjacent community. We only have bus service. And honestly, every community around us has a commuter rail and they just have better service. So I knew kind of going into this, 3A conversation, sometimes the community might have a little chip on their shoulder because, they don't feel like they're serviced as well as our neighbors. And as a result, I think that sometimes we're a little challenged with that. A little over a third of our land is owned by DCR. I feel, or I believe that town residents feel we're pretty tight already, and that's okay. We have an elected planning board, an elected select board, and we're the Wild West, known as open town meeting, which I know I love. I feel like it's made me a much better planner, and I feel like I have to be intentional and strategic with everything I do because of the open town meeting. Because you are going to be in a room, you have no idea how many people are going to show up. You are going to have no idea what their perspective is, and it's really like it's like the roll of the dice when you walk in. And something that's important to know is 1 in every 3 households qualify for housing assistance today. And I guess for some perspective, our 40B percentage on our SHI is under 5%. However, we've made significant housing strides over the last 5 years. And I want to share that because I think that we shouldn't think about 3A in a bubble in a lot of ways. And I do celebrate Stoneham's achievements when I'm speaking publicly about housing. It's like, you know, we've done a lot of great things over the last 5 years. We're a 2-time housing choice community. We've grown exponentially population-wise. We've been designated an age-friendly community, something that was really important to our residents. We wrote and had approved our first housing production plan. We passed inclusionary zoning. We established an affordable housing trust, not that there's any money in it, but it's really the small steps in getting there. And something that's less positive, we concluded a 10+ year 40B case. Again, I mentioned that we're under 5% for affordable housing. And I think that although 40B isn't directly necessarily tied to 3A, I think it's important to kind of have those parallels because the town really felt the impact of a 10+ year court case where the outcome was not favorable as the town would see it to the town in the respect that, you know, the developer won, they prevailed in court. And I think that lack of control or a lack of feeling like there was a lot of control in that development, I think gave a lot of perspective to residents in town. So here's what we did with 3A, and this is kind of what we've done. So starting very similar to kind of some of the communities that Judi mentioned, I immediately, once 3A was announced, I immediately started updating our planning and select boards. I think it's really important to make sure our elected officials were up to date on this. I very much use the approach like, I'm here to help you. I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm here to give you information. We are welcome to have different opinions, but like, here's the information, right? And at that initial meeting, we stopped any conversation of should we comply, should we not comply? And I get that the horse is out of the barn in some cases, in a lot of communities, but really having that focus of saying like, okay, this is our opportunity, like, let's talk about this. And at that meeting, at those meetings, we talked through, you know, updating one of our existing zoning districts actually complied almost. So it was consensus that we would start there. And at our May 2022, so this is before a lot of the guidance came out, I was like, let's just start here. Let's just, you know, we didn't make it more complicated. We made it as easy as possible. Like, let's not overcomplicate it. Like, we're not going to have a capacity cap. We're not going to have, you know, units per acre. We're not going to do these things. Instead, we're just going to say, you know, multifamily housing is going to be allowed by right. And a developer will just have to design it based on our other regulations as guidance. And it passed unanimously at open town meeting in May 2022. As guidance came out, we continue to update via public meetings. So I went to other select board meetings and planning board meetings and just kind of kept communication up to date. And over the summer, I worked with the planning board and the compromise overlay district known as the North Main Mixed Use Residential Overlay District. Yes, it is that long of a name because why not? Was a compromise. Initially, I wanted our entire highway business district to have by right housing. We had a lot of really great conversations, and I'm glad we had those conversations because things that I don't want to say I was tunnel vision, but a lot of the things that I was hyper focused on, it was less focused on by our other elected officials. We have a split tax rate in town. And, a big concern of, a lot of our elected officials is that if you take our largest commercial district and allow housing by right without it requiring a mixed use, they were worried that that would negatively impact our commercial tax base. And I thought that was a really great point that I wouldn't have thought of, without that kind of conversation. So we went from a 77-acre district to something a little more, a lot more smaller. But the boards were really comfortable with it. They felt good going into town meeting, and that also passed unanimously in fall of 2022. I am a staff of one. I love to say that. I'm sure everyone who has heard me speak in a meeting knows that already, but we decided that I received the compliance model Excel sheet. I call it the Excel sheet of death. And I was like, this is not going to work for me. So I immediately applied for technical assistance through MHP for some assistance with compliance modeling in spring 2023. And then once I was kind of getting all our compliance paperwork together, I realized that we need an EFA or an economic feasibility analysis because our inclusionary zoning that we just passed was above 10%. So we were able to apply for community one-stop grant program funding for that. And then we submitted it to EOHLC in December 2023. And I'm just waiting to hear, hopefully, the good news, or at least some feedback on how we can move forward with that. Our compliance model looks great. Our EFA was favorable. I feel pretty good about it, but it's not official till it's official. So I just want to kind of share some key takeaways. Something that I always talk about is you educate those trusted voices. If you are going into a town meeting or city council meeting, representative or, open, you need to not be the only one holding that warrant article. Like this is not your bylaw. This is not your article. This is everyone's kind of bylaw. And you need to make sure that you are not the only one that can speak smartly about this and not make it too complicated. You need to be prepared to pivot conversation. This is Open Town Meeting 101, but there are always, I guess, going to be haters, or there are always going to be people who are rooted in just wanting to be difficult in some cases, or just want to say no. And you really need to pivot that conversation. There's always common ground. Something I heard initially, was like, oh, I don't want us to enter another community's name here. And how to pivot that conversation is like, okay, like it sounds like you have opinions about where housing should go, or you feel very strongly about that. Can you share like what you would suggest, or what is important to you? Like what aspects are important to you that we need to maintain in our zoning? And then really strategize that path forward and really look inwardly to determine what you need, and then utilize those existing resources that are available, that technical assistance, that community planning grant, all these other things that are your regional planning councils. Like it's so important, and guide communities to those success. You need to help them succeed. You are the expert, hopefully. You are the expert or one of the experts in town. And you really need to guide them to that success. I probably did some unorthodox things, like we did not talk about compliance modeling. We did not talk about units per acre. We didn't talk about those highly technical things. I kept it really basic, and I said, okay, like where do you want this multifamily housing to go? what is comfortable for you? What does that look like? And we're going to go step by step. You're not going to worry about requirements. Let's just, talk basics. Like, let's talk about like what matters to you. Where do you want to put it? And our two zoning districts that, qualified under 3A, one was in the north and one was in the south. Like, I didn't stick them in the same neighborhood. I didn't stick them in the same school district. Like, we all have to kind of figure this out, kind of thing. And then celebrate the wins. Like, I think it's really important to say, like, we've come a really long way. And that's something I've really been conscious of over the last 2 years, is to make sure that people understand like what they're doing is really important. And it isn't outcome based. It's really saying like, we're going to be compliant, and we're, going to take matters into our own hands, and it's not going to be a big deal. And we're just going to get this done. And it's really important that they really celebrate that, because I think it's really easy to catch the negativity bug or that perspective that, the state can't tell us what to do or any of that. Like that, let's not have that attitude. Instead, let's say like, yeah, this is our zoning code. Let's figure out what we want to do, and let's work on that together. So I will stop there. I probably talked more than I should, but that's just me.
No, that was inspiring.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad. And honestly, I need to kind of just preface this by anyone who has not worked in Stoneham before, worked with or, around Stoneham before. Like, we are not, I will self-identify us. We are not like a super progressive community necessarily when it comes to housing growth or when it comes to zoning. Like, our zoning code's from 1985. They have staffed one planner since I got here 9 years ago, and they had no planning department for 13 years before that. So wherever you are in your zoning and planning journey with your municipality, like, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
We'll get through this kind of thing. And it's a marathon. Like, don't feel like, the walls are caving in. Like, I really like, once we get that Fallon district achieved unanimously at town meeting, it really gave us the momentum to really keep moving forward with this. And I think sometimes, you want to get into compliance all at once. And sometimes it's about getting those little wins or getting, momentum moving so you can just kind of keep it going. So I'll stop there. But I think Brian's up next from Danvers. So Brian.
Why, thank you. That was great, Erin. And I do miss being your next door neighbor in Winchester for 9 years as well. So
I know, I miss having you. You are missed.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen real quick. So the timing of this is certainly affected a lot of things. So I started here in Danvers January of 23. So just about 15 months ago. And frankly, really lucked out because of that. So the first thing I did in January was do the action plan. So it kind of was it literally was my first week there. I submitted the action plan being here in Danvers. I, though, relied on a lot of good work from the previous planner, Mr. David Fields. Shout out to him. Don't know if he's on, but so David Fields and my boss, the director of land use and community services, did a huge rezoning effort. So I'm going to go through that very quickly. I've had a very different experience based upon not just the people that have shared today, but many communities that I've talked with, simply because we already bought in. So I'm going to explain that. So the timeline. So in 2017, there was a small 40R district that was adopted downtown. Prior to that, no housing was allowed whatsoever. So we started out in kind of this small, like, oh, this, it's basically one big development, and it's actually being built right now. Steel is up, and that should be, it's 143 units. In 2020, that, the 40R didn't get expanded, but it essentially did. meaning what is not actually a 40R, but it was a larger mixed use district. And the whole reason why that district was kind of couched as it was part of this MBTA Communities Law. So even though it was kind of in the regulations hadn't gone out yet, the goal and how it was billed to this, we're a representative town meeting here, how it was billed to everybody was, we want to comply with this law. This is why. It was nearly unanimous. So that's kind of where I started in from 2020, a whole town that's actually very mixed and politically. It's a very purple town compared to a lot of other towns around. It's more like 60-40 red blue, something around there, 60-40, 65-35. So in 2020, there was a robust amount of neighborhood meetings, information sessions, specifically for this rezoning, because it was turning this whole, non-mixed use area into a residential zone. So good news is that just last month, we adopted changes necessary to comply with the law. So that is now been sent to the Attorney General, filled out my Form 7, patted everybody on the back, and we'll see how that goes. We did apply for a pre-review with EOHLC in November, leading up to February. We heard they were given 90 days. We heard at day 90 that we were close, but not quite there. Luckily, it was nothing with the bylaw itself. It was kind of questions related to the compliance model. So, we'll see what happens with the AG review, but we're very confident that we addressed all the concerns. So, how this actually happened in February of 24, just now. So, my strategy was really focusing on town meeting members. So we did very targeted outreach to town meeting members. Boards and committees were kind of like copied on it, but really it was town meeting, because we knew that all these people unanimously voted for it. They want to make this happen, and we're just tweaking. So this was totally billed as a tweaking of the downtown, and it truly was. And we went basically through all the mechanics of what is being tweaked. So a little different from Erin, where you had to have this like larger conversation of like, what do you want? How do you feel comfortable? We're in the nitty gritty of like, we're changing these 4 numbers. So that's because that's all we were really doing. The office hours actually, I found to be the most, in terms of efficient, even though it sounds like completely inefficient, because you're only really getting those real serious conversations with 3 to 5 people in the course of 2 hours. And it's like, that's really no low numbers. You're not really getting a lot of information out. However, the people that really care and or even that they are against it, they're coming. I'm giving them the, full treatment of exactly to make them feel comfortable on what's actually happening. And those one-on-ones, and this is nothing new, the one-on-ones hit the best by far for me. So, I found a lot of success in having these office hours people drop in and not feel kind of stressed out about meetings or anything like this, and just say, give it to me straight. So those were by far. So the info sessions were good, but the office hours were undoubtedly the most helpful. So I'm going to go through some of these very quickly because everyone's gone through this, but these are some of the slides that I shared during the meeting in terms of, why is the state, what is this law about? Why are we doing this? I'm not going to go through this I'm going to go pretty quickly, but how this was built again was Danvers Town Meeting already recognized the need for more housing downtown. We're just tweaking it to comply. So, that's the general thesis of the whole situation. I did go through with non-compliance. So the rail trail is a big deal here. We got over $1 million grant to kind of expand that and make that happen. So that certainly, goes a long way here in terms of saying, well, we wouldn't be able to have that funding. We also would not be able to have additional funding that we plan to apply for related to the rail trail and other physical resources that are really important to Danvers residents. And also I told everyone that we were also in the middle of applying for things as well. And I did get, so this is a little bit of nitty gritty to let people know exactly what's going on. So we were an adjacent community. The only bus that we do have goes to Liberty Tree, but the bus doesn't go downtown. It doesn't go, really too many places. One big question was, well, what if we do get bus service downtown? We're going to have a lot more residents downtown. Will that change anything? And, we said very clearly, no, that would not change anything. So the 40R district is the blue area in the left. So that was done in 2017. And then the rest, the orange, red, and green, that was done in 2020. So this we did, again, get into the nitty gritty of exactly what are we doing. So it's about the entirety of the district is about 87 acres. We said, well, look, if you just want to do the bare minimum, that density is going to rise. And having that conversation of expanding and contracting the district and what actually happens, that was actually a lot of these one-on-ones that people had to really get a handle on it. It was difficult for some. So this was like literally the entirety of what we were changing, other than small bylaw changes, like actual little tweaks. So like this is the slide that was up for most of the time and saying, what are we changing? Is we're literally changing, the minimum densities. We did talk about build out because we did do a max build out when we did zoning in 2020. And we're like, the max build out's not changing. And we also said, frankly, we're changing this to 15. We're probably not going to get any applications at 15. And that's just the truth. We're not seeing that now. We're not anticipating that later. And it's because there's a lot more money to be made and a lot more housing that needs to be created. So we did downplay it because of the truth. No other reason. So this was a good slide as well. So the typical lot downtown is less than a half acre. So we're basically saying the typical lot, so current or previous, it was 12 units per acre, which was a pretty good guess for the previous work that was done. So they tried to comply before the regulations even came out, and it was the lowest minimum in the whole. There were 4 sub-districts, but the lowest minimum was 12 units per acre. So we said, look, and the smallest minimum the lowest minimum in the entire area is 12 units per acre. If we change that to 15, on average, we're really talking about 1 more unit per lot. That resonated with a lot of people. People are like, oh, okay, whatever, that seems fine. So that using the math to your advantage, I think it really worked out for me. These were the other necessary changes that we needed to perform in order to become compliant. The only real thing was that we changed some parking minimums. Out of everything, by far the parking minimums was the most amount of chatter, the most amount of problems, there really wasn't a lot more questions. There was like, well, are we going to build a parking garage downtown? And we're like, we have so much parking capacity. So then we ended up giving a whole parking conversation about where we are right now in terms of parking numbers. And it turns out we need more signage, more management, but certainly not more spots. So that's kind of all I have. Sorry to speed through, but I guess I will hand it back to Katie.
Thank you. And we're going to just go through a few of the questions. This is a long session, so I think everyone wouldn't mind eating their lunch soon. So, but one question I had for you, Brian, was the process dealing with EOHLC on modifying the 40R. What was that like? How did that work?
We didn't modify the 40R.
Okay.
So the 40R is still there. It's built out. And frankly, nothing's going to happen there for, I don't know, maybe another.
I see. You just created zoning that was kind of like that near it.
I mean, it was a traditional, more mixed use zoning that complies, but is not technically a 40R. So that blue area in the map stays a 40R, is a 40R, counts as part of the district. But even if it didn't, we would still have everything we needed in terms of 50 acres and all of that. But it is part of the district, but is still an overlay 40R currently.
Excellent. I'm gonna just go through, there's really not a lot of questions. But I'm getting one right now. And people have done a great job answering each other's questions. But there will be, okay, just the general fear as an emotion as to what that would look like, with more housing. How do you, fear is such a complicated emotion. How do you respond to that in a way like that doesn't sound snarky? So I'm just kind of curious if Judi or Ian, if you have any responses to that, or any of you.
I do think having images, pictures of projects, not just buildings, but projects that are roughly commensurate with the proposed zoning does help. Even if it's not in your own community, but something next door, something people might be familiar with, just so they can get a sense of what this is. I would say Monica and Andover did an amazing job pulling together examples of development that already is in that community, already is roughly commensurate with what's being proposed. It does help to take the fear factor out, because people have, especially in very low density communities where people have no idea what 15 units an acre is, they don't even know what 4.8 units an acre is, let alone 15. To be able to just show what that looks like, I think does help.
There's some comments.
And Katie, I do think knowing what the fear is rooted in is also really important. So, for instance, our school elected officials felt like this is going to completely demolish our school districts, and we have 5-year-olds on top of each other already, and I'm sure other people have heard those kinds of comments before. So what we did was just say, like, okay, what is the most recent, multifamily housing developments? We had a 297 unit housing development in town. We pulled the census data and found out there were 12 total humans under the age of 18.
Wow.
The majority of those were not in the school district because they were babies. And then we compared it to a traditional subdivision that was in front of the planning board, a 13-lot single family home subdivision. So we were, kind of talking through like, well, you're okay with this single family home subdivision, but you're not okay with this, even though we have the data that shows like our largest, multifamily, dwelling don't yield the amount of children that I think you are assuming. I think that's really important. I mean, you can't counter someone saying, well, I just don't want it, right? Or it's going to change us, or those kinds of things. I don't think there's a counter to that, other than you can reference other plans that say, we talked about it in the housing production plan. You want more variety in housing. You're saying that you don't have a place to go, but your home is too big. Well, how are we going to do that? And typically those are, I think it's really important to find out where the root of their problem is, and then go from there. And then have real life, like look around examples, I think is really helpful.
Just a couple for our experts here. One is, does commercial development, multifamily housing, does that count as for a commercial tax base?
No,
it's a rental
residential use.
Right. Great. And then there was another question, the perennial question about groundwater protection districts. And because many communities, like the one I worked in, the groundwater protection was the town. It was everywhere in the town. And it didn't limit use that much, but I don't know if Judi or any of you have dealt with an underlying groundwater protection district. And
in most places we've worked, there's something like that. And you know, if you can avoid being in it, that's great, but a lot of communities can't, even if it's not the whole town. And so what the town attorneys have advised the communities we've been working with is to, you know, either exempt the 3A overlay district from the groundwater protection rules, or to treat the special permit criteria as something that would be reviewed under site plan review. So it basically like a performance standard. But to exempt it, because you can't subject a project in a 3A district to a special permit. It's just that simple.
Yeah,
So you have to figure out, you either exempt it or you take what you can and treat it as a performance standard. But most of the ones I've seen are just exempting it.
and actually, even though I think the speakers on this call are all quite expert at this point on what those guidelines say, you know, I probably should steer away from those, like, will it, won't it, questions should be going to EOHLC.
Or their town attorney, Katie.
Or their town attorney, exactly. I think people need to call a lot on their town attorneys. So we only have a few minutes left. I don't know, Ian, if you had any final thoughts about how this is going.
A lot of thoughts. If anybody else is like me, you have trouble falling asleep some nights thinking about 3A.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing I thought about when you were mentioning fear is, number one, you don't have to validate their falsehoods, but it's okay to validate that it's a scary thing. And I think a lot of times when people come at you with the fear, and it's true, that people are afraid, I think it's okay to say, like, I get it, this is a scary thing, and this is something new, and it's not easy to tackle, because you don't necessarily want to tell someone that their emotions aren't valid, because that's going to cause some challenges. So I think starting with validating that this is a scary thing, and then going with like Erin was just saying, we looked at some of the numbers and this is the case. And I think that goes a long way, and at least tempering down the situation, especially when you're in a public meeting with 30 people in the room and someone starts to get their temper up a little bit. I think it's recognizing, like, yeah, you're right, this is scary. Let's figure out how we can do it together.
There's a nice comment in the chat that said in their community, they've responded to the fear with new housing means new neighbors and new friends, which I think is really great. So
I also think we've noticed, I'm sorry, Katie.
No, go ahead.
I think the other thing we talk about with the fear piece is we kind of turn it around too, because we've noticed people are afraid of how expensive the housing is in their town, and they're afraid that their kids can't afford to live there and their grandkids can't afford to live there. And so people seem to have two fears at once. It's fears of new development and it's fears of not being able to afford to live in their community. And I think we need to recognize that we can accomplish both of those fears. I mean, we can mitigate both of those fears throughout this process. And so we also talk about, like, are you okay with how expensive housing is? Are you afraid of that? And most people are. And so then talking about how this is a tool to address that has been key.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to stress, like, that is probably the most common theme I hear. It's that, you know, housing is too expensive in Eastern Massachusetts. We want more options, but not those options. And we're like, well, you know, the only thing you can really have is more and smaller housing, you know, the way it works. And I think they think of 10-story buildings. So it's like, there's nothing in between, that middle housing, the 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, up to 10, which are clearly going to be more. We're going to see a lot more of those 5 to 10 unit complexes, quote, a lot, more, around a lot more, because you can get 15 units per acre in a nice, small 10 unit, townhouse or whatever it might be. But people do have problems with saying, I want this, but I don't really want it that much.
Yeah, well, I think maybe unless anyone else has any more comments, we can give people 5 minutes back to run out and get their sandwich or whatever it is. But the great questions and fantastic panel. So thank you so much. And as Emma said, the slides will be on the housing toolbox. So at MHP. So thank you again. Thank you again to our speakers. Good luck, everyone. Hang in there. Yeah.